Saturday, June the 3rd, 1989, Bamidbar. In the Chumashim on page 572, the book of Numbers, chapter 2, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, the Israelites shall camp each with his standard under the banners of their ancestral house. They shall camp around the tent of meeting at a distance. Camped on the front or east side, the standard of the division of Judah, troop by troop. Chieftain of the Judites, Nachshon, son of Aminadab. His troop, as enrolled, 74,600. Camping next to it, the tribe of Issachar. Chieftain of the Issacharites, Nathanael, son of Tzuar. His troop, as enrolled, 54,400. The tribe of Zebulun, chieftain of the Zebulunites, Eliab, son of Chelon. His troop, as enrolled, 57,400. The total enrolled in the division of Judah, 186,400 for all troops. These shall march first. On the south, the standard of the division of Reuven, troop by troop. Chieftain of the Reubenites, Elitzur, son of Shedeur. His troop, as enrolled, 46,500. Camping next to it, the tribe of Simeon. Chieftain of the Simeonites, Shelumiel, son of Tsurishadai. His troop, as enrolled, 59,300. And the tribe of Gad, chieftain of the Gadites, Eliasaph, son of Reuel. His troop is enrolled, 45,650. The total enrolled in the division of Reuven, 151,450 for all troops. These shall march second. Then midway between the divisions, the tent of meeting, the division of the Levites shall move. As they camp, so they shall march, each in position by their standards. On the west, the standard of the division of Ephraim, troop by troop. Chieftain of the Ephraimites, Elishama, son of Ammihud. His troop, as enrolled, 40,500. Next to it, the tribe of Manasseh, chieftain of the Manassites, Gamaliel, son of Pedatsur. His troop, as enrolled, 32,200. And the tribe of Benjamin, chieftain of the Benjaminites, Abidan, son of Gideoni. His troop, as enrolled, 35,400. The total enrolled in the division of Ephraim, 108,100 for all troops. These shall march third. On the north, the standard of the division of Dan, troop by troop. Chieftain of the Danites, Achiezer, son of Amishadai. His troop, as enrolled, 62,700. Camping next to it, the tribe of Asher. Chieftain of the Asherites, Pagiel, son of Ochran. His troop, as enrolled, 41,500. And the tribe of Naphtali, chieftain of the Naphtalites, Achira, son of Enan. His troop, as enrolled, 53,400. The total enrolled in the division of Dan, 157,600. These shall march last by their standards. Those are the enrollments of the Israelites by ancestral houses. The total enrolled in the divisions for all troops, 603,550. The Levites, however, were not recorded among the Israelites as the Lord had commanded Moses. The Israelites did accordingly, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So they camped by their standards, and so they marched, each with his clan, according to his ancestral house. This is the line of Aaron and Moses at the time that the Lord spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai. These were the names of Aaron's sons. Nadab, the firstborn, Avihu, Eleazar, Itamar. Those were the names of Aaron's sons, the anointed priests who were ordained for priesthood. But Nadab and Avihu died by the will of the Lord when they offered alien fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai, and they left no sons. So it was Eleazar and Itamar who served as priests in the lifetime of their father Aaron. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, advance the tribe of Levi, place them in attendance upon Aaron the priest to serve him. They shall perform duties for him and for the whole community before the tent of meeting, doing the work of the tabernacle. They shall take charge of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting, a duty on behalf of the Israelites, doing the work of the tabernacle. You shall assign the Levites to Aaron, to his sons. They are formally assigned to him from among the Israelites. You shall make Aaron and his sons responsible for observing their priestly duties, and any outsider who encroaches shall be put to death. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I hereby take the Levites from among the Israelites in place of all the firstborn, the first issue of the womb among the Israelites. The Levites shall be mine. For every firstborn is mine. The time that I smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt, I consecrated every firstborn in Israel, man and beast, to myself, to be mine, the Lord's. And the second reading in the Chumashim on page 948, page 948. Page 948 in the Chumashim, first book of Samuel, chapter 20, verse 18. Jonathan said to him, tomorrow will be the new moon, and you will be missed when your seat remains vacant. So the day after tomorrow, go down all the way to the place where you hid the other time, and stay close to the Etzel stone. Now, I will shoot 3 arrows to one side of it, as though I were shooting at a mark, and I will order the boy to go and find the arrows. If I call to the boy, hey, the arrows are on this side of you, be reassured, and come, for you are safe and there is no danger, as the Lord lives. But if instead I call to the Lord, hey, the arrows are beyond you, then leave, for the Lord has sent you away. As for the promise we made to each other, may the Lord be witness between you and me forever. David hid in the field. The new moon came, and the king sat down to partake of the meal. When the king took his usual place on the seat by the wall, Jonathan rose, and Abner sat down at Saul's side. David's place remained vacant. That day, however, Saul said nothing. It's accidental, he thought. He must be unclean, not yet cleansed. But on the day after the new moon, the second day David's place was vacant again, Saul said to his son Jonathan, why didn't the son of Jesse come to the meal yesterday or today? Jonathan answered Saul, David begged leave of me to go to Bethlehem. He said, please let me go, for we are going to have a family feast in our town, and my brother has summoned me to it. Do me a favor, let me slip away to see my kinsman. That is why he has not come to the king's table. Saul flew into a rage against Jonathan. You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, he shouted. I know that you side with the son of Jesse, to your shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness. For as long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, neither you nor your kingship will be secure. Now then, have him brought to me, for he is marked for death. But Jonathan spoke up and said to his father, why should he be put to death? What has he done? At that, Saul threw his spear at him to strike him down. Jonathan realized that his father was determined to do away with David. Jonathan rose from the table in a rage. He ate no food on the second day of the new moon because he was grieved about David, because his father had humiliated him. In the morning, Jonathan went out into the open for a meeting with David, accompanied by a young boy. He said to the boy, run ahead and find the arrows that I shoot. And as the boy ran, he shot the arrows past him. When the boy came to the place where the arrows shot by Jonathan had fallen, Jonathan called out to the boy, hey, the arrows are beyond you. And Jonathan called after the boy, quick, hurry up, don't stop. Jonathan's boy gathered the arrows and came back to his master. The boy suspected nothing. Only Jonathan and David knew the arrangement. Jonathan handed the gear to his boy and told him, "Take these back to the town." When the boy got there, David emerged from his concealment at the Negev. He flung himself face down on the ground and bowed low 3 times. They kissed each other and wept together. David wept the longer. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we two have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord. May the Lord be witness between you and me, and between your offspring and mine forever." David then went his way, and Jonathan returned to the town. Recha. Recha is feeling excluded by the Torah reading, where it says that that God has a special relationship with the Levites at the end of chapter 3, that they play a special role. I don't think, Recha, that it says... Well, does any member of the congregation want to deal with that question? I would like people who don't speak regularly to speak. I think if the same people speak each week, I think people who don't speak get put off a little bit. This is a democratic institution. I like to encourage people who don't speak regularly to speak occasionally. It's not a difficult question. How do you make of this? Look at the end of chapter 3 rather, verse 11, 12, and 13, where it says that God says, "I take the Levites from among the children of Israel in place of the firstborn." That is to say, they are surrogate. As you know, in ancient pagan culture, the firstborn was killed. We call this Moloch worship. It was a religion that was widespread in the ancient world, involved the killing of the firstborn children. And here God is saying to the Israelites, "I don't want you to kill your children. I just want the Levites to work for me permanently as a labor force in the sanctuary." Now, Recha says, well, what about us? Doesn't God love us? How would you address that? Stuart.
I don't feel that I excluded. I feel there's a sense of sanctity, a sense of awe.
Excuse me, sir, are you a Levite?
No.
Okay, I just want to be sure.
But despite that, or maybe because of that, I like the fact that the people are not one amorphous mass, but there's a Havdalah, there's a distinction that each group has its specialty.
Yeah, but I think Recha is suggesting that there's some kind of an elitism here, that some kind of a class system exists here, that somehow, because God has chosen the Levites for this particular role, that therefore your ordinary Israelite is somehow not as beloved to God as the others. Howard?
I think what's implicit here is a sense of order. There is not going to be an unruly competition. There's not going to be warfare, presumably, amongst or between the tribes of Israel, because they've set down
Okay, Howard, the dominant word that Howard uses, and I think that's the word that we really need as a rubric under which we can discuss the first reading, is structure. You can see in the Chumashim on page 572 that neat little map. Can you see that neat little map? I mean, those of us who know something about the Jewish people are fascinated by this neat little map. There's a march tomorrow on behalf of the State of Israel, and some of us occasionally have attended either that march or the march on behalf of Russian Jews, and we know how little the neat map actually resembles the ultimate free-for-all that often develops when people are getting into position and so on and so forth. But Howard is right, the word is structure, and I think particularly this week I'm very powerfully struck by what Howard says. He's saying that how else would you decide how this people is to be organized unless some kind of hierarchy was imposed upon it? And so, Recha, in partial answer to your question, it's not that God doesn't love you, but that God hates chaos. After all, the Jewish God, the Hebrew God, the God of Israel, is the God whose first act, whose first item on the agenda, as it were, in creating the world, is to try to create order out of chaos. And in so doing, the various parts of the universe have to be constructed: the sun, the moon, the stars, the heavens, the earth, the waters above, the waters below, the mountain ranges. So creation presupposes some kind of structure. And it's not that God doesn't love the other people, but that in order to have a people, you had to have something analogous to the Israelites. Gil? Yeah, Gil is drawing attention to the fact that the firstborn has always played a very special role in Jewish tradition. I think I should back up a little bit, because there is an anomalous dimension to our discussion here. As I'm sure many of you know, in Jewish tradition, the Jewish people, even to this day, is divided into priests, Levites, and Israelites, Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. When this synagogue was founded, Rabbi Kaplan, in his wisdom, decided that these distinctions were meaningless because the Jewish people had rejected the notion that the temple would ever be rebuilt. And from a rational point of view, what was the point of maintaining these distinctions if there was no practical purpose for them? Now, the result of that is that we no longer care about those distinctions at the SAJ, and I have a little bit of a problem with that. It's more complicated than would appear on the surface, because there are various rigorous rules relating to marriage which affect priests, particularly whether priests are permitted to marry divorcees, so that regardless of the issue of whether or not we're going to rebuild the temple, and of course, thinking back on Rabbi Kaplan's earlier pronouncements, some of them possess all the innocence and naivete of an era in Jewish history which could still cling to innocence and naivete. There are quite a few Jews in Israel of a fundamentalist ilk who have a plan to blow up the mosques on the Temple Mount and to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And I'm given to understand by usually well-informed sources that various yeshivot in Israel are currently training students, scholars, in the minutiae of the laws relating to sacrifices in the belief, this is not my belief, I'm just giving you the news, so please don't confuse me with the views that I'm mentioning here this morning, that one day the temple, I believe an attempt already has been made to try to bomb the mosque. It was stopped by the Israeli police. Of course, this would, I don't even want to think about the kind of havoc this would work in the Muslim world if this actually happened. But we have our fringe lunatics, as every group has, and I do believe that this issue is held quite seriously, this belief is held quite seriously by some very Orthodox Jews. The question of dividing the priests and the Levites and the Israelites was also rendered somewhat moot by the modern democratic notion. When I was a child, I was of course a teenage Orthodox Jew, as many as you know. When the Torah was opened in public, a priest was always called to the Torah reading first, even though it was the same priest every time the Torah was read, because that priest, by virtue of the fact that he was a Kohen, had prior right to making the blessing over the Torah. I remember getting quite irritated as a child. It seemed to me grossly unfair. It seemed to me grossly unfair that the Kohen got all the blessings. It was always Ya'amod Kohen. If there was no priest there, a Levite was asked to come. But in case anybody got the idea that the Levite was being honored, the blessing went Levi Bimkom Kohen. That is to say, as a surrogate for the priest. So even in absentia, the priest was still given this place of honor. I remember as a young Orthodox child feeling that this was grossly unfair. That, this guy got the chance to say all the blessings and nobody else did. But there was structure. Can one imagine if there was no order or structure in the service? This is how it happened. The Kohen got the first bite, the Levi got the second bite, and an Israelite got the third bite. By the way, that is why Shalishi was regarded as an honor. Shalishi cannot be an honor at the SAJ, because since we don't call a Kohen first and a Levi second, what's the value in being third? The honor was, if you weren't a priest or a Levite, you were called up on the first possible occasion you could be called up, not being one of the hierarchy. Now, I'm not even going to suggest that as one of the items on the agenda for the ritual committee next year, we have a second look at the chaos that Kaplan has wrought in the SAJ by ignoring dissent. It's true that problematics occur because of conversion and because of marriage and because of divorce. But my feeling has always been that attempts to be too rational and too logical, like the little square diagram at the bottom of page 572, often lead to more chaos than one would have had if one had not originally tried to be so methodical, logical, rational, and orderly. And so in answer to Recha's question, I can only say that the priests and the Levites did not regard their honors as a kind of favoritism. It was a burden. It was an obligation. The priests had to adhere to a much higher level of ritual purity than your ordinary Israelite. And the Levites were constantly burdened by the project of having to put the sanctuary up, put the sanctuary down, and between them, the priests and the Levites had to preside over the sacrifice, the roasts, I mean the literal roast. Tomorrow's roast, I think people might have got the wrong idea, is going to be a purely metaphorical roast. That is to say, somebody had to supervise the arrangements that were made, and then there had to be some structure. One almost could say that it was a burden to be a priest or a Levite. And you were better off being an Israelite, even though the priests did get to make the blessings and other things. Carl?
You mentioned that for all of the wonderful things that people worry about with the Kohanim and the Levites, they had no property, they had no land. It's not mentioned in the second. They were not allowed to have material things. They had to, in a sense, whether they were entitled to a portion, they were, in a sense, beggars at the same time, and recognizing, in a sense, that absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Thank you. Carl has drawn our attention to something that I should not have overlooked, and I appreciate his reminding me. Of course, the the crucial factor about the priests and the Levites is that unlike the rest of the Israelites, they were not allowed to own property. They were entirely dependent on the generosity of the people and on the loyalty of the people to paying tithes. Nevertheless, in a week when China is bursting at the bounds and Russia has been on television, its political leadership is on television, and the most incredible things are happening which nobody would have believed of even a couple of years ago. That is to say, one sees both in Russia and in China some kind of a vague, inchoate attempt for the will of the people to be expressed. And one has to ask oneself whether the Russians and the Chinese are ready for it, or whether there will be more chaos under the new arrangements than even existed before, if that is possible. Clearly, to those of us who live in the West, the notion of two populous societies going through some kind of revolution is mind-boggling, and one really does not know where things are going to end. I'm not even sure whether anybody knows what's going on and why it particularly started now. At any rate, to go back to Howard's point, the Israelites had been a slave people. They were moving towards a settled land. They had no tradition of government. They had no tradition of politics. They had no tradition of democracy. They had no tradition of free ballots. They had no tradition of any kind of leadership. They had been slaves for 400 years. And at least in the interim, it seems, there was a need for a structure, a need for some kind of organization which the people by themselves would not have been able to organize. We notice that even structured though the organization was, on several occasions there were rebellions, there were revolutions. The people wanted to return to Egypt. And so this must have been the minimal kind of organization that was imposed on them. Jeff? No, I don't, actually, but then, of course, I come from England, and as a child, I was regaled with stories of how in the First World War, when somebody, one of the officers shouted, attack, and everybody was supposed to climb out of the trenches and attack the enemy. If some private at that time had begun to shout for his mother, the story that we were told was that the officer simply drew his pistol and blew his brains out on the spot. That this happened very frequently pour encourager les autres. In other words, to make sure that there was some kind of system there. In other words, there were certain situations, like in war, in order to avoid panic, you had to shoot anybody who began to fall apart. You just couldn't allow that rot to set in when an individual panics, because the whole battle could be lost. By the same token, we don't have a people living on its own land here. We have a group of slaves, wandering slaves. Rules and regulations had to be laid down, and they had to be rigorous. You can't argue with a slave mentality. I don't have a problem. I don't like the idea, but liking is not the issue. The issue is survival. In order to survive, Moses had to conduct a very rigorous regime. Otherwise, the people would not have survived. I'm not denying that it was on some level dictatorial. I'm not denying on some level it was authoritarian. There's no question about that. The question is, were these people ready for self-determination? Yes, what is your name? John. Well, you ask the question, you answer the question. Think. In view of what I've just said, that these are people who are basically slaves. They are slavish in mentality. The first problem that comes their way, they think of the food they're missing in Egypt. God has given them, through Moses, freedom, and they want delicatessen. I mean, think. What does it mean? What does it mean? And you say it looks as if they're being organized to march as an army and not as what? As an outing at Club Med? I mean, how would you run this? How would you organize? You're Moses.
I mean, the way you describe it is that they're a community. They're organizing it as a community. They're marching as a community. Who is their, why are they in arms? Are they in army because there are enemies out there? Where presently they meet some nations along the way. But
The enemy is themselves. The enemy is their own incipient anarchy. The enemy is the Jewish tendency to divide, to split, to argue, not to accept the rule of the leader. The tendency is built into the old Jewish joke, 2 Jews, 3 synagogues, 4 opinions. Or the story of the desert island, where a Jew was shipwrecked once and was there for 40 years and built himself 2 synagogues. And when he was finally found, the captain of the ship that picked him up said, "Why 2 synagogues?" He says, "One I daven in, the other I wouldn't be seen dead in." It's almost as if Jews need that kind of oppositionalism to survive. We are well described by tradition as a stiff-necked people. The enemy that faced the Jewish people as they wandered through the wilderness was far more their own weakness, their own cowardice, their own pusillanimity, their own lack of faith than any external enemy. And you are absolutely right. It is an army. The army, that is to say, Moses has imposed on them the equivalent of martial law. That's why Jeff was so upset at the notion that people would get killed, but that's what martial law is. Theoretically, martial law is imposed when one feels that the community is not structured enough to be able to endure, that certain things might happen and the very delicate structure of community will be destroyed. This is what's going to happen in Russia and China. Russia and China are not ready yet for democracy in our sense of the word. There are vast areas of America which are not ready for democracy yet. What are we talking about? Democracy is a very, very delicate flower. One's hope is that over the next 50 or 60 years, some form of benevolent despotism will lead both the Chinese and the Russians towards a much larger participatory mode of government. But I'm not sure whether it's possible. I'm not sure whether there are certain nations, groups of people, perish the word races, that simply are not amenable to democratic procedures. So what is your name? David. The Bible, I would say, and let's be clear when we use the word Bible, I'm using the word Bible in the narrower sense, namely referring exclusively to the 5 books of Moses, which is the nuclear concept of Torah. The term Torah has many meanings. It can mean the entire Bible, including the 5 books of Moses and the prophetic writings and the so-called hagiographer, or the so-called writings, and sometimes it's used to cover Jewish knowledge which has developed since the writing of the Torah, Mishnah. Well, the broader sense makes it much more complicated. I'd rather deal with the smaller sense to begin with. Namely, in the 5 books of Moses, to reformulate your question, what evidence is there that an attempt was being made to organize the people in a way in which they would have a greater control over their lives as opposed to being the subject of a very structured, hierarchical, benevolent, despotic situation. And the answer to that, I think, is that to me is the whole purpose of the Torah. That the Torah in itself is a slow process in which, although laws are given, distinctions are made between the people, like the distinction between priest, Levite, and Israelite. Historical associations are made between the firstborns of the Egyptians, the firstborn of cattle, the firstborn of humans, the firstborn sacrificed to Moloch, the firstborn surrogates via the Levites, and so on and so forth. There is an attempt, and in fact studies have been made on this topic to show how when one studies the Bible from a political perspective, the authors of the Bible seem to be trying to say the need for a Moses, namely a strong, autocratic, almost despotic leader, is only an ad hoc situation. The hope is that once the people settle in their own land, they won't need to have somebody like Moses, and that somehow they will be able themselves to find some meaning and purpose in their own self-governance. The very fact that we have the names of the leaders mentioned in the reading this morning, those names, which I read with great care, because after all said and done, we assume somebody once stood behind those names, and we pay tribute to those names and the people behind them. We have no idea who they were. Two of them you should have noticed. One of them, Shelumiel, the son of Tzuri Shaddai, for some unknown reason which still escapes me, gave rise to the Yiddish word Shlemiel. I've searched the sources. If anybody can answer that question, why Shelumiel, son of Tzuri Shaddai, has come down as a byword for Jewish stupidity, I don't know. But Shlumiel became bastardized into Shlemiel. Don't be a Shlemiel. Presumably Shlumiel must have been a Shlemiel, but there's no evidence why. The other name which is mentioned, which indicates some kind of personality behind it, is Nachshon, son of Aminadav, that has given rise in modern Hebrew to the phrase Kefitza Nachshonit. Story is told that when the Israelites were commanded by God to cross the Red Sea, and that God was going to perform a miracle, God was prepared to perform a miracle, but he wanted the Israelites to do something also. He wanted them to jump before the waters actually parted, just to show their good faith. And of course, nobody wanted to jump. And Moses kept on praying, and God kept on saying to Moses, "Nu, nu," and Moses said to the Israelites, "Nu, nu," but nobody jumped because nobody wanted to get wet first. Isn't this a well-known story? Isn't this a well-known story? Until finally, Nachshon, the son of Aminadav, jumped into the water, which apparently only went up to his waist, and began to wade into the Red Sea. And the story goes, he waded, and the water came higher and higher and higher, and at that moment, the waters divided. You see, you had to go to before the waters actually divided. So that is Nachshon, son of Aminadav. Now, apart from that, we do have the names. Now, I take that as evidence. The mere fact that the leaders of these groups, the princes, were mentioned by name was a kind of a sop to the democratic spirit. Moses was saying, I can't give you much authority right now because you'll act like Shlemiels. That is to say, you'll be thinking only in terms of your tribe, whereas now, if we are to survive, we may only think in terms of the whole. The group as a whole must survive. If somebody gathers sticks on the Sabbath day, he must be put to death. If somebody violates the law, he must be put to death. Martial law must obtain. But in the hope that one day this group will be able to govern themselves, we're going to mention a lot of names. They may not get very far, but they'll know that their names were mentioned. I think Robert Alter, in his book on the Bible, draws the fantasy of each one of these princes waiting and waiting through this laborious announcement of details until they heard their name pronounced correctly. I lived in a rabbi's home for many years of my life, as you well know, and one of the greatest sources of aggravation to the entire rabbinical family was what in those days was delicately referred to as the Ladies' Guild. The Ladies' Guild held various tea parties on Sunday afternoons, and the major responsibility of the chairman of the Ladies' Guild was to make sure that the London Jewish Chronicle carried the name of the lady in whose house tea was served that Sunday afternoon. And woe and betide the spiritual leaders of the congregation if by some accident of typesetting or some clerical error, Mrs. Cohen was spelt wrongly or incorrectly, or the name was displaced, or it didn't get into the newspaper one week. The entire synagogue was rendered into a condition of turmoil. I remember this as a young child, wondering why people were so obsessed with having their names spelt correctly. And now that the computer era has arrived, and I get all kinds of letters addressed to me as Rabbit Miller, Ms. Alan Miller, or lately just M-I-L-L-E. I've been Gallicized. I appreciate a little more this obsession of my youth with Ladies' Guild representatives having their names correctly spelled. But these are people's names. There is also a book, the title of which escapes me right now, written by a political scientist from Berkeley, California, he is a political scientist who made a study of the Bible as a political scientist, believing as he did that the authors of the Bible were trying to show exactly the point that you're asking about, how one makes the transition from an autocratic, benevolently despotic society, which is fragile and has to be held together from the outside, and the more democratic kind of society. And I was fascinated by his interpretation of Shalach Ami V'Yavduni, let my people go. His interpretation was that the central thrust of the Bible is let my people go, but not from God, from Moses. That the ultimate goal was that the people should be self-sufficient without Moses. That Moses was needed for a particular era in their history, the way Winston Churchill was needed for a particular era in British history. Winston Churchill was a total failure before 1939 and after 1945. But during the war, nobody else could have done what he did. Moses was a very special kind of a person. The enormous aggression. You needed somebody like that to take a bunch of slaves from Egypt to Palestine. Palestine, they could allow themselves a little more chaos. Patricia. Patricia, thank you very much indeed. But I don't think that the Haftarah is, what was the word you used, contradicts. I think, on the contrary, it serves as a brilliant contrast that both elements have to be given their proper weight. That is to say, and don't forget that this week we have a purely random juxtaposition of these two readings. It happens to be that tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and therefore, because the opening words of the Haftarah are Machar Chodesh, tomorrow is the new moon, we are then given the benefit of the next 30-odd verses or so. Now, obviously, it can't be that that's the reason why the rabbis chose this reading for today. Otherwise, we'd have had a different kind of reading, the reading which would have been the traditional reading for Bamidbar. But nevertheless, when you're dealing with a sacred text, this is my belief, when you are dealing with a sacred text, any random juxtaposition will show you important and crucial contrasts. And we could not have had a more creative contrast this morning, and I'm indebted to Patricia after all this talk we've had about chaos and structure, the importance of martial law, the importance of people getting shot if they get out of line, the importance of getting rid of any kind of panic, having people behave like automata, having military, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, a purely military regime. You have a complete contrast in the Haftarah reading, this incredible story of the love of David and Jonathan. Now, the thing about this story is that Jonathan is behaving in a most unstructured way. To be perfectly honest, I have to fault Jonathan for not asking Saul's permission for David to be absent. David was the king, and you don't do things behind the back of the king. If there is an authority, then the authority is there. What Jonathan was doing was taking upon himself the responsibility of absenting somebody from the king's board. You know, I mean, to be present at the king's table on Rosh Chodesh was an obligation, noblesse oblige. Well, Americans wouldn't understand these things, but in England, where I come from, in the Times many years ago, whenever the king had breakfast, there was a list of people who had coffee with him. You know, Lady Jane Hotsmachai was present while the king had his egg and bacon, whatever. And she had, you know, Yenta Farfala, maid in waiting, and all the retinue. And it was all in the London Times. I mean, look, believe me, I'm in America right now, and I value American egalitarianism. There's no place like Manhattan. No place in the world like Manhattan. I love Manhattan. I love Manhattan. But, you know, I remember the elitism of England. Now, Recha, that was elitism. That's what has ruined Great Britain, God bless her. The elitism, the caste system, still there. Now, Jonathan was wrong. He disobeyed his father. He should have said, Dad, is it okay if David doesn't attend? But they were trying to test Saul. And from their point of view, I'm not saying whether they were right or wrong, Gil?
Was he wrong? Didn't he know that Saul was so jealous of David that he wanted to kill him? And David was to protect his friend?
Well, you know, you're right. That both Jonathan and David knew that Saul meant no good to David. Of course, we know what we're not supposed to know. We know that Jonathan is a dead duck, and we know that David is going to be king. We know that. You see, we're in a kind of a bind. We know the end of the story. But the participants, the protagonists, don't know the end of the story. I accept what you're saying, Gil, but not really, because if we are going to apply the rules of the Torah reading, martial law, don't get out of line, otherwise I'll shoot you. If the society is not yet secure, and I don't think anybody can say that the society was totally secure. This is just the beginning of the monarchy. We've just got the first, Saul was the first king, wasn't making much of a job of it. In a couple of reigns, we're going to have civil war in Palestine, and the kingdom will divide into the north and the south, something Americans can well appreciate, into the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. That is to say, the attempt to apply structure is not going to work. The Fissionizing tendencies is in the Hebraic tradition. The tribal tendencies are going to take over again. As a matter of fact, we know that this has been the case in Hebraic. I wish I could remember the name of that book. It'll probably come back to me before the end of the morning, and if it comes back to me, I will remind you. The political arrangement of the ancient Hebrews was the same as the ancient Greeks. It has a special name. It's called Amphictyony. Amphictyony. It's a name given to a loose-knit gathering of tribal states which unite together only against an external enemy, but when there is peace, they like to keep as far away from the others as possible. Does this strike any chords in those of you who know American history? It's the same issue. Federal government state government. I mean, human beings haven't changed that much. The different tribes did not want to be united. They were only forced into unity because divided they were going to be destroyed by their enemies. But there was always a tendency to divide. The North and the South did in fact divide. And as for the Jewish people today, we only think of arguments between Orthodox and non-Orthodox. But if you really know any Orthodox Jews, you will know that within Orthodox Judaism today, the differences are so awful and so sharp and so vicious to be unbelievable. It almost makes the relationships among non-Orthodox Jews a tea party from Alice in Wonderland by comparison. So the Jews have always been a fissionizing people. Jews don't like to get together unless they're under extreme pressure. Now, against this context of order and structure, as Patricia rightly says, we have this incredible antinomian story where a son defies his father. This is worthy of a death penalty under martial law, even though it's a son. And Jonathan, against all the evidence, puts his love and friendship, the humanitarian dimensions of this relationship, the feelings he has for Jonathan, before his obligation to his father and his father's dynasty. That is to say, the contrast between the book of Numbers and the reading from Samuel could not have been more marked. There is one more observation I would like to make about the story of David and Jonathan. The point has been made by many commentators, by Robert Alter and others. It's so evident, but it has to be constantly stressed. For some reason, which we can only fathom, the characters of David and Saul and Jonathan are the first real, live human beings characterized in the ancient world. When one thinks of Gilgamesh, one thinks of Enkidu, one thinks of the Assyrian monarchs, one thinks of the Egyptians. Scour the ancient mythologies, scour the ancient texts, scour ancient literature. You will not find anything other than cardboard people before you get to the writings of the Jewish Bible. And there, beginning about the 10th and 9th pre-Christian centuries, you suddenly have real, live people that we can identify with. Human beings who often put love and friendship before obligation, who have different standards of morality, who refuse to be bound by one line of morality, who insist that human beings are not pawns in a game of chess and have a right to make their own minds up. And sometimes when they make their minds up, their minds don't follow the way their parents think, or the way their leaders think, or the way other people think. Now, the one thing that... Patricia, let me ask you a question. Why do you think David cried more, Patricia? Why do you think David cried longer? Why do you think David cried longer? You think he knew? You think he knew deep down that between him and Jonathan, only one of them was going to survive? And therefore he wept longer because he knew that he was the one who was going to survive, because he felt he already had had the call. I think there's something very tragic about this, that in a sense Jonathan knows that he's doomed, and David knows that Jonathan is doomed, and Jonathan knows that David is going to succeed, and yet contrary to the kind of palace intrigue that we have in almost every ancient palace, instead of Jonathan siding with his father and arranging for David to be killed, Jonathan follows his emotions and his feelings. This is something that is quite unique. And I don't see this as a contrast or as a contradiction. I see it as the authors of the Torah saying to us, both are necessary. When chaos threatens, we need law and order. When panic and anxiety threatens to disrupt a society, we need force and we need power. The time for being forbearing is not when a society or a community is falling apart. But at the same time, while that force is being applied, and while those decisions are being made, the challenge of the love of David and Jonathan comes through to us with its powerful clarity that order and law and structure and power and dictatorship, even on an interim level, are simply insufficient. The love that individuals have for each other. It's very striking, by the way. It's the love of a man for another man. Could have been a whole different story. Could have been a man and a woman. After all, the books of Samuel and Kings are full of these kinds of stories. And yet here it is male bonding, male friendship, which is at stake. And we are told that at the same time that we look at these pretty structured diagrams where everything is at a sharp angle and everything fits in, the reality of the matter is that things don't always fit in. There's one other thought which can bring us closer to home and our own lives. After all, David's and Jonathan's and Saul's and Moses are not around so frequently these days. Isn't the difference between that neat little drawing on page 572 and the harsh reality of the deception and the intrigue, and the arrows are beyond you and the arrows are not beyond you, and go home quickly, take the gear, come out, don't come out, you're in danger, you're not in danger. The discrepancy between the neat, organized pattern and the disorder, isn't that what happens in family life? I mean, isn't it? It's like the Christmas party in that story in the Dubliners, you know, where everybody invites people over for a festive meal. It's a Passover, it's Christmas, it's Easter, it's Yom Tov, whatever. And before the first course is served, some ancient enmity between brothers or sisters or cousins or aunts or uncles or somebody who hasn't spoke to each other since a wedding that took place 85 years ago suddenly erupts, and before you know, the kishka is thrown across the table or the Christmas pudding is on the floor, and somebody says, well, I knew that you'd ruin my dinner tonight. I knew that this family couldn't... We've never heard of this kind of thing happening, of course. We all have structured houses like page 572, where no glasses of wine are ever thrown over, and everything is organized, and people talk nicely to each other, and children, above all, are respectful to their parents, and never act out and fight and complain and argue. So that the two readings today can be removed from their global implications instead of Jewish survival, and be given a very simple human rendition. That the best laid schemes of fathers and mothers, as Robert Browning once said, gang af agley. In other words, that you can try your hardest to have a nice family outing, and somebody is going to act out and spoil everything. And the question then is, what do you do? Is it martial law? Is it, I'll give you $10 if you shut your big mouth for 5 minutes? I think we will leave that for the structured, organized but loving kiddush which the Jarmo Rosenthal family have prepared for us in the social. We rise for Aleinu, page 194.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל.